Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Reading Party podcast with Megan and Lexi. This episode continues our season looking at stories set in the Roman Empire and its periphery. Some of the material includes themes of violence or sexual assault. It is not suitable for under 18s. We hope you have your favourite beverage and snacks ready to go, because we've got our teas and are ready to start spilling the tea on our latest ancient story. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Reading Party podcast. This is our Rome extravaganza season, and today we are going to be talking about the 2011 movie The Eagle, which is based on a 1954 novel by Rosemary Sutcliffe, The Eagle of the Ninth, which we usually try and do the book before the movie, but we didn't do that this time, so it's going to be an interesting reversal of our normal order. And here to talk to us about the movie is Lindsay Allason-Jones, who is actually the historical consultant for the director. So, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to see you all.
Oh, it's wonderful. Would you mind, before we get going, just telling us a bit about yourself and how you got into Roman Britain?
Well, I, for many years, was Director of Archaeological Museums for Newcastle University, the main museum being the Museum of Antiquities, as it was then, which is the senior museum for Hadrian's Wall. So I've spent a lot of my time looking after the material from Hadrian's Wall.
So you were really the perfect person to have consulting on this one.
Well, theoretically, it was the British Museum who rather evilly recommended me because the team of Duncan Kenworthy, Kevin MacDonald and Jeremy Brock were very keen to make the film. Apparently, when they were making Four Weddings and a Funeral, they'd all been sitting around having coffee and rated it one of the best books of their childhood, and they wanted to make a film about it. So they went to see the British Museum, and the British Museum says, no, you need to go and speak to Lindsay. And as they were thinking of filming actually in Northumberland, they thought they might as well go and check that out and check me out at the same time. Unfortunately, they arrived just as I was dismantling the Museum of Antiquities to move it to another building. So they got rather a short hour amid complete chaos of a dismantled gallery. But they must have heard what they wanted to hear. I obviously gave them what they wanted to know. But I still was quite surprised when I had a phone call from Duncan Kenworthy asking me if I'd be the historical advisor for the film. And it sounded to me like a collectible experience. So I talked to the university authorities and they said, yep, go for it. So that's what I found myself doing.
That's fantastic. And for those who are unfamiliar with the film and with the book, the story follows a Roman called Marcus who starts out in the Roman army, gets himself posted to Britain and ends up having an honourable discharge for protecting his soldiers in battle, but he's wounded so badly he's unable to carry on. And he makes the decision to cross over the wall and go into the terrifying north of Britain, accompanied by a British slave, to try and recover the titulary eagle, the standard of the 9th Legion, who have gone missing and were commanded by his father. So he's going to kind of avenge family honor, recover the eagle, and just generally make a name for himself and restore his, like I said, his father's honor. And long story short, they are successful, but they do have to steal the eagle back from the Seal people, who are an absolutely fascinating tribe. And he is almost killed on the way home, and they find the rest of the 9th Legion, who have essentially gone native after having been attacked by a cohort. Well, not really a cohort. What's the word I'm looking for? A grouping?
Tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. A tribe of Britons, not British people, Britons. They make it back to southern Britain and civilization with the eagle, and it's all very, very heroic and very exciting. Now, you said that they originally wanted to film on Hadrian's Wall. Were they able to do that, or did filming have to take place elsewhere?
No, in the end, the filming took place in Hungary. So my advice was being given across telephone lines because the university, although keen for me to do this, were not so keen on me going off to Hungary for a whole load of time. So unfortunately, I didn't go with them. But apparently, Northumberland did not strike the right appearance, apparently. Look too civilised.
I was going to say, I imagine it's not as wild as they wanted.
Well, the bits they wanted to film in were not as wild as they wanted. They did film some of the Seal people up in Scotland, but I didn't get to that either.
We were actually talking before we started because Lexi studied in Scotland. My parents live in Scotland. And we were trying to work out which bits, like, was there actual filming happening in Scotland? Was it all in Hungary? And it felt very Scottish, even if it wasn't actually.
Well, it was a place called Ochilty and also Old Dorney. Do you know where Old Dorney is? No. Well, those bits apparently looked suitably
They
wild.
were appropriately Scottish.
They were appropriately wild, yes.
Now, what was the process like for you as an historian advising something like this? Did you find that people were interested in keeping to the historical truth of the time, or did you have to be content with them fuzzying certain bits?
There did have to be a certain amount of fuzzying. There were actually, as the main team, were quite keen on having as much authentic detail as possible. And on the whole, if I said something was wrong, then they did try and correct it. The problem was really that there's such a lot wrong with the book. Now, I realise this is heresy for people who are Rosemary Sutcliffe fans, but Rosemary Sutcliffe wasn't an archaeologist, and she was writing in the 1950s. Her knowledge was based on what was publicly available at the time, which was not a lot. Hadrian's Wall was not the tourist centre it is today. Very few people had ever been. And of course, she herself had Still's disease, so she wasn't actually capable of going to see it herself. So there were quite a lot of discrepancies between the book and what could have actually happened. And for starters, at the very beginning of the book, Marcus arrives in charge of a cohort. Now, the problem is Marcus is only a centurion, so he would only been in charge of 80 men, not the near on 500 men of a cohort. And he arrives to take charge of a fortress. Well, there's absolutely no way a centurion would be in charge of a fortress. That was something that tribunes and prefects and, really people well up the food chain of the Roman army would be involved in. In fact, looking after a fortress was very often a sort of career step to becoming a senator, not the sort of thing that your average centurion would have anything to do with. Also, he arrives to take charge of a place called Isca Dumnorium. Now, that was the Roman name for Exeter. And this is supposed to be a frontier fort. And there's no way that Exeter was ever a frontier. And at the time this action takes place, it had turned into a civil town. There wasn't a military presence in a major way there. So I ended up suggesting they had a small lookout post on the Severn, for which there is absolutely no archaeological evidence whatsoever, but it seemed the lesser of the evils, really, than having an anachronistic fortress under the command of a mere auxiliary centurion. There was also a problem with the dates. If Marcus arrived in Britain in AD 140, then he's arriving just as Hadrian's Wall is being disbanded, and the action has all moved up to the Antonine Wall. Now, I don't know whether Rosemary Sutcliffe either had never heard of the Antonine Wall or didn't understand the dating or whatever, but we just had to go with Hadrian's Wall because that's what's in the book, and hope that nobody actually did any maths, and they very carefully avoid mentioning any dates whatsoever in the film. But I did ensure that the bits on the wall itself look really scruffy, because by this time it would be being disbanded. And I must confess, the Mile Castle, I was very proud of the Mile Castle, and its rather fat soldiers, because they were absolutely what you would expect to see in a military installation which is on its way out. I was quite impressed by that.
I have to say, it definitely did not look like the pinnacle of defence that I think some people might have expected Hadrian's Wall to be. It was very obviously
by that time
doing
it was
well.
Very much second-class place, yes. But, I mean, there were other things like the leather armour. Now, they wouldn't have worn leather armour of that particular type, but the problem is with films is that they don't usually make the costume specifically for a specific film. They get what is in whichever organisation is providing them with the costumes.
I did not know that.
Well, I didn't have. I discovered slightly later on, and in a completely different context, that in Antony and Cleopatra, the Liz Taylor and Richard Burton film, they were wearing the same clothes and armour as was worn in Carry On Cleo, which was a fact which entranced me. I loved that. But anyway, this is what was available as leather armour, so I just put up with that. I couldn't get them to do anything about the helmets because a certain amount of the action as how Marcus is identified as being a Roman soldier is because he's supposed to have a scar under his chin, which would be the result of wearing a Roman helmet. But Roman helmets don't rub there.
That was actually going to be one of my questions. Is this an actual thing from history or is this made up?
This was made up because I think possibly Rosemary Sutcliffe had only ever seen pictures of Roman soldiers on Trajan's column or something like that, where it does look of its rubbing, but it's not. It's hanging down, unless the soldier's got an amazing double chin, which I don't think Channing Tatum had at the time, and it's not going to work. But the story hinges on the scar, so the scar had to keep going. There were some things I did say not to have. And when I saw the first rushes of it, I was invited down to London to see it, and I had my little notebook ready to write down anything which I wasn't happy about. And one of the things I'd said was no stirrups. Roman saddles didn't have stirrups. And looking very carefully, I thought, they've got stirrups, darn it.
They put stirrups on.
And I said afterwards, why have you got stirrups? I said, no stirrups. And they said, well, neither Channing Tatum or Jamie Bell were very confident riders, and the insurance company wouldn't let them on a horse unless they had stirrups. So probably only I could see it because I was looking out for it. And the other thing I said was no togas, because very, very few people in Britain would have worn a toga. I mean, it was only really visiting Romans or people in a particularly ceremonial situation would have worn a toga. And then blow me down, there they are in their togas. And Duncan was very kind. He said, well, just think of it as light summer cloaking, he said, because when they'd shown the rushes to a focus group in America, the audience couldn't work out which were the Romans and which were the non-Romans, because Romans wore togas. So he didn't have white ones, though. I must confess he was very good. He had different, slightly pale colours. But no, togas are light summer cloaking, according to Hollingwood. So that's the way it works.
Light summer cloaking, that's fantastic. I love it.
Always the Americans coming in and ruining a good thing. We can't recognize who's Roman unless you have a toga. Like, oh man, that's a bad take for us.
Well, there was also the thing that made me laugh also was the naming of the film, because that went to the same focus group as to what they should call it. And they were going to call it Eagle of the Ninth, as in Rosemary Sutcliffe's. But apparently some people thought it was about golf.
No.
And other people worried they'd missed the first 7 and 8th. So they decided just to call it The Eagle, which I thought would think it was a film about birds, but apparently
the Eagle can be about anything, though. The Eagle of the Ninth, I mean, I understand why they changed it, but I feel like that very firmly situates it.
Yes. So I had a lot of entertainment in many ways on this.
I can see that.
So you brought up the fort, which I love because, I see the fort and I'm like, oh, that looks like a real Roman fort with real specifications. Like, that's brilliantly done. So the one sort of gripe right in the film that I have around this, though, is so right after Marcus arrives, he basically goes, oh, no, the grain delivery is delayed and I'm going to send out a little squad to go and try to find it because there's a roaming droid. Now, my memory is fuzzy and I'm not an expert in this time period or in Britain, but I'm pretty sure droids banded together, not just randomly roamed, but maybe I'm wrong. So would this have been historically correct? Because I don't know why there's just one droid.
No. Druids were religious priests. They were wise men, and they didn't tend to be all over the country anyway. It's amazing how much is written about Druids, considering how very little is actually written about them at the time. And they certainly would have been on Anglesey, because we have Tacitus tells us that they were there, and they would have been in the south of England. But they weren't marauding hordes. I think there is a tendency for people often to think of Druids as being synonymous with Celts or synonymous with Britons, and they are not. They are a priestly class. And I suppose even priests can go rogue, so it's always possible that one of them had turned into some sort of outlaw, but unfortunately that was in the book as well. My original copy of the script is absolutely covered in red pen.
Like any good academic would. Nope.
I'm afraid so.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
But there were some good bits. I mean, they did the most wonderful testudo.
Yes,
I was really thrilled by that. Yeah, that was really good.
I always marvel because it is kind of actually one of my favorite things from the beginning of the film, because I'm always like, they run out, they do it. It looks very realistic. And I was like, well, clearly there was research put into it.
No, that was fine. I mean, in that particular situation, a wedge formation would have been slightly better, but it was a good testudo. So they definitely got brownie points for me on that one.
Well, that's excellent. I'm generally in favor of the beginning of the film. Sometimes I'm like, would that have happened? I don't think anyone really would have cared or noticed. But the thing is, I see the one chariot right, that they use. And from what I remembered learning in undergrad for my classics degree, I was like, well, they didn't really use chariots that much in battle. They were more like your Uber taxi to the battlefield and you get off and then you fight. And then if you live, it comes back and then Ubers you back to your camp. But I guess in this scenario, would they have actually charged in with a chariot?
The other side would have done.
Okay.
The Iron Age people of Britain tended to fight with chariots. The Romans, no. The Romans, on the whole, regarded them, as you say, as transport. But those sorts of chariots are actually more the sort of thing they use for racing rather than anything else.
I wanted to ask, and I don't know if this is something that can be answered with the current state of research or what's available to us. How much do we know about the tribes living in Britain around this time? Because I know they didn't write their own information, so what we have comes from other sources. Is there an awful lot, or is it just kind of, well, fuzzy?
It's patchy. There's been an awful lot of excavation of Iron Age sites in Britain. There's not so much written evidence from the time because, as you say, the local tribes did not have a written language, and what is written about them at the time was written by the enemy, i.e. by the Romans. And some of that might be quite accurate, some of it is not particularly accurate because Julius Caesar and Tacitus and people like that were not anthropologists, and they wouldn't necessarily have been asking questions themselves or observing things very closely themselves. So there's quite a bit of difference. The thing that one has to remember is that each tribe in Britain would have been very different. They weren't necessarily used to fighting invaders coming from somewhere else. They tend to fight each other. And some tribes had female leaders, some tribes didn't have female leaders. It's quite likely they all spoke some sort of Celtic dialect because Celtic dialects were spoken all over the whole of Europe at the time. But whether they actually understood each other, because even today, people up in, say, Glasgow may not understand people down in Devon. And it's quite likely that although they theoretically spoke the same language, there may have been quite serious differences which would not have helped to make everybody friendly.
So if we had someone like Esker who is from a specific tribe guiding Marcus to the north, there's this understanding in the film that Esker would have been fine because he's a native Briton. No one would have batted an eyelid and he'd be welcomed as a friend and as a guest, but Marcus, as a Roman, would have been shot on sight. Would it, in reality, probably have been a bit more complicated than that, and there may have been tribal rivalries that Esker would have had to negotiate?
Well, Esker was a Brigantes, wasn't he? And the Brigantes tribe covered a very large area of the north of Britain, north of England, that is. And they seem to have reasonably got on with quite a few people. So, I mean, he was probably taking a chance. As long as he kept to the east side of what we now call Scotland, he was probably okay. On the west side, he might have had a problem. He would have possibly been able to make himself understood. Whether he is welcomed with open arms, he might have had to sort of, as indeed he had to sort of argue his case, didn't he? He wasn't welcomed in immediately.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that sort of irks me. I mean, I understand that you have a specific runtime and you can't put all the nuance in a film, but like when he goes, especially they find the seal people, like he's immediately welcomed as like honored guests. And I'm like, but really, would he have, like, that seems really...
No, I think they would have checked him out pretty thoroughly before they were that excited. I mean, what was a little bit irritating was that the film team presumed that all I could give them was advice about the Romans. They didn't realise that I could also have given them advice about seal people as well. And I did feel the seal people were somewhat underdressed for the climatic conditions of Scotland.
Yes, that was going to be another question because there are some very bare legs going on there.
Yeah, the touch of the last of the Mohicans crept in there, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but I will say one of my favorite things about this film that other films don't even attempt to do is show the difference in language. And so I thought it was kind of astonishing how much they were able to put Scots Gaelic in, although I'm kind of like, again, the one weakness, right, is it can't show that this movie, if you were only to watch this, you might assume then that everyone north would be speaking the same version of Scots Gaelic, which just isn't true.
Well, they wouldn't be speaking Gaelic at all.
Right, they wouldn't have been speaking Gaelic at all. Actually, you're right, because Gaelic came from Ireland.
Later on, yes, exactly.
Right, that's right. It comes from Ireland. So, I mean, they wouldn't have been... But, I mean, I was like, is there anything else they really could have put in that would have been closer to what was spoken? Because that was the other thing. I was like, it's probably they don't have anything else, right?
I think what was also interesting is that they used American actors to imply the Romans and English actors or Scottish actors to imply the local Britons. So the Romans, the invaders, the dominating group, was played by the Americans, which my students quite liked. They quite liked that bit.
It's a nice change because I know a lot of times British people are the Romans, so you have to have the English accent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I do like the interplay of language, though. Very much. It is a favorite. So maybe this is obvious because I haven't read the book, but one thing that always fascinates me is the relationship between Esca and Marcus and their journey. Because historically, right, with Romans, didn't they revile slaves? And so I always felt like the Roman attitude toward Esca was pretty spot on, where they hated him, they didn't like him, it was pretty hostile. Although when it comes to Marcus, he's sort of like immediately trusting, let him live. And then I trust him to not, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if it was a book thing, but I always felt like, could they have started Marcus off at a much more contentious relationship? Because I feel like it would have made their sort of turn into buddies even stronger by the end if they were able to overcome this huge historical animosity. Because it just seems like he starts out trusting Esca almost too much. And I don't know, like, was there not time to do that?
I think Rosemary Sutcliffe was trying to imply that Marcus was actually quite a good chap. Slavery was very much a matter of normality in the Roman Empire, but also in Britain. I mean, one of the reasons that it was stated that the Romans invaded Britain in the first place was because it was a source of gold, silver, hunting dogs and slaves. So slavery was a fact of life before the Romans arrived in Britain. And people's relationship with slaves would obviously depend very much on their own personal nature and the personal nature of the slaves themselves. But Marcus probably grew up with slaves in his household. We have several inscriptions from Hadrian's Wall of centurions, such as Marcus, having slaves with them to look after them and do the housework and cooking and all the rest of it. So I think it would depend very much on the individual people, how they would get on. But I think Rosemary Sutcliffe was trying to imply that Marcus was a nice man and therefore he wasn't being unkind unnecessarily.
Okay.
And I think also she wanted to contrast the fact that when Esca appears to shop him to the seal people, Marcus was hurt. You know, he wouldn't have been hurt if he didn't like the fellow in the first place. So he would just thought, par for the course.
Okay. Again, sometimes I'm just like, maybe I'm just not getting it, because there is a book that I'm sure explains a lot more than an hour and something 2-hour film can. And that kind of leads into like the other thing that I always sort of observe. I do find it a bit hilarious when Esca and Marcus are wandering about trying to, find out what happens, right? They run into Gurn, one of the legionaries from the 9th who disappeared. And I find it really interesting because we meet him. He sort of starts by explaining, he was like, yes, well, these 4 tribes sort of banded together and they converged on us and they were massacring us. And then he kind of talks about how he has a family and that he was like, I don't understand why Rome sent us here. There's nothing. So he seems very much like he now doesn't sort of like the Roman expansionism policy, which is interesting. So, I go, okay, well, he looks like he's quite comfortable. But then I'm like, but if he's kind of like, no, we didn't understand, we didn't want to do this, Rome, I don't know. And then he comes back at the end to fight for the standard. Is that just like the deeply, deeply ingrained Roman values seeping through? Because if he's been truly integrated into the culture up there for like 20 years, suddenly being like, yeah, I didn't really want to do this, Rome, stop.
I don't know. That's an interesting one. I think the legionaries that Marcus comes across are now outlaws. And I think they would have been a bit annoyed that the Roman army didn't come to rescue them. They disappeared. Nobody came to find them. It took 20 years before somebody turns up. I do find it fascinating they still seem to be able to fit into their uniforms, though some of them clearly have doubled in size in the interim, which fascinated me. But they would have taken an oath to the emperor over their legionary standards. And the eagle would have been carried by each legion. There would have been one for each legion. And if you lost your standard, then you really had failed your emperor and the empire. So there must have been a feeling that they were ashamed of having lost their standard, but also narked that nobody came to rescue them, but aware that they'd taken an oath. So I should imagine psychologically they were very confused about the whole thing. So when there was something to fight for, which seemed to bring all this together, then I can see that they would possibly think, right, this is our moment, get on with it.
Yeah, okay. It's just a stray observation that I always make. And I'm like, I don't know why you would just go back and fight for them. Like, woo, but okay, cool. In service of the plot.
I wanted to ask, and forgive me because it's been a long time since I studied any Roman history at all. Does the story of the Eagle of the Ninth, is it rooted in any kind of historical information, or is it entirely fictional?
Oh, no, there are some facts. I mean, Rosemary Sutcliffe was inspired by the discovery of a bronze eagle at Silchester, which was not too far from where she lived at the time. And each legion, as I say, had a legionary standard which had an eagle on the top. They had other standards, but that was one of the main ones. And there was also the fact that the Ninth Legion did wander off. They were based at York, and then they suddenly were not based at York, and nobody knew where they were. Now, this has recently been part of a lot of discussion because everybody thought they'd gone into Scotland and been beaten. I mean, the Ninth Legion did not have a good reputation. They'd already been whomped by Boudicca before. So there weren't as many of them as there would to start with. They hadn't covered themselves in glory to start with. So I think classicists thought, well, this is what the Ninth do. They're not very good. But then they found some tile stamps of the Ninth Legion at Nijmegen in Holland. So then everybody thought, oh, right, well, they got sent off to Holland. There is a possibility that having been the Legion based at York, they may have gone up to help build Hadrian's Wall, but built the turf section on the West End, which has no inscriptions really surviving. And therefore, they disappeared out of the inscription record. There are also some other hints that they might have ended up further east on the continent in Armenia, but that's a bit dodgy. But recently other people have been going back to the idea that they went up into Scotland and somehow failed miserably to do something. So there is a mystery. We still don't actually know. They disappear off the lists of the legions. Every now and again there's that list appears that says we've got these legions and this is where they are, and they just disappear completely. Because it may be that they were officially disbanded and the men spread around other legions. The Roman Empire had cutbacks just like any other organisation. We actually don't know. So, yes, she was right. There is a mystery, and she came up with a solution. Whether it's the right solution is still debated quite hotly.
So I'm kind of curious. I know, obviously, with consulting, it's hard to push for certain things when basically you have kind of a finished script anyway. But one of the notable things that always does interest me is that there's a very notable lack of women in the film, except for the certain ones kind of up in the tribe with the seal people. So was it worth trying to fit in some more women, female characters, or no? Not at all?
I think they were trying to make it an adventure story. In Rosemary Sutcliffe's book, there is actually a side story, which is a little romance between Marcus, who must be in his 20s, late 20s, and a girl called Cottia, who also has the name Camilla, who is only 13. Now, I can quite see why they didn't want to include that. A, it confuses the situation, but also it would really jar with modern audiences. And it is something which Rosemary Sutcliffe was following classical Roman information. The major aristocratic families in Rome would marry their daughters off very, very young. They wouldn't do it elsewhere in the Roman Empire. And in fact, the people of Britain, the Celts generally over the empire, thought it was wrong for a woman to marry until she was about 21. So nobody was very pleased with this bit at all. So out she went. The dog also got cut out as well. So
oh, man. Well, I definitely see why they would not want to bring that over. Yeah. That would make many
But I think also it was an adventure story, and this was just, it would just added unnecessarily information.
Yeah, they want to make a buddy film about two guys, so that's what we get.
Basically what it is. To a certain extent, it was a bit irritating that because I wrote a book called The Women of Roman Britain. So, if I was going to be a historical advisor about anything, a film that didn't have women in it did seem a little ironic to my colleagues, but that's the way it goes.
Oh, that's funny. That's often how it goes. Sometimes I wonder, like, how did a film choose their historian? Because it's like, oh, they had them consult, but on like the most basic things, because what their actual expertise in is like half the time, yeah, they don't seem to take advantage. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the reason was because I spent a lot of time, and not just working on the women of Rome Britain, but also on artifacts. So the table they have at the end where they're having their banquet, absolutely everything on that table is exactly as it should be. I must say that one thing that did strike was a bit irritating was, again, due to the theatrical costumiers, cloaks need brooches. And a 4th century brooch had snuck in there, which, again, only I would have noticed. But most of the actual details of the artifacts are spot on, because that was my expertise. So I think that's the reason why they thought I was probably the better person to do it, even if we didn't have any women in there.
See, I wanted to know about, like small details, because the other small detail that I found interesting that they like sneaked into a line of dialogue was when I guess the old senatorial friend of his uncle came to that one dinner scene, essentially. And you hear them being like, yes, we have dinner, boiled eggs and fish. And I was like, oh, that's really specific. And that also sounds quite accurate.
Oh, yeah.
Did they actually come to you and be like, tell us, what is something they would have eaten so we could have a dinner scene?
Yeah, I had to do that. I also had to come up with suitable swear words, which I actually asked a colleague of mine for a classics person, that one. Yeah, all that sort of detail. They were very, very keen that I should be able to say, what would they eat? What would they do after dinner? What sort of games did they play? So I had to send them information about a game called Ludus Trunculorum, which was something that the Romans tended to play, with all the information about what sort of playing men would be on the board and what sort of arrangement would be on the board. So, yeah, Duncan Kenworthy actually sent me an email long after the event. He'd had an email from a female professor of classics at a South African university who had written to him saying how wonderfully accurate it all was. And I emailed back, said she didn't spot the stirrups or the 4th century brooch, did she?
That's fantastic. I have to say, we've watched an awful lot of films that seemingly do not care at all. They are using the past essentially as window dressing.
Yeah.
And watching it, even as a non-specialist, it felt a lot more authentic. And it's really gratifying to hear that actually the directors did genuinely care about getting it right and about listening to what you had to say.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin MacDonald, when we first met, said he really wanted this to show what Roman Britain was like. And I was quite keen on that because The Eagle of the Ninth is a book that children read. And children do Roman Britain at Key Stage 2 in the British educational system. So I was really annoyed by the beheading scene, because the beheading scene cut it out that children would not be able to go to see it. And I thought they really lost half their audience with that one, because it's a book for children. The team had read it as children, but that one scene was gratuitous violence, which really wasn't very sensible.
Yeah, it does, unfortunately.
They got excited by the story, I think, at that stage, and off they went, chopping heads off.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, like they could have had children. So I'm curious, like how much of the process after the film was made, did they want your help in promoting the film in any way?
Yes.
Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, that was very interesting, because having spent the best part of a year trying to get the main team to understand the differences and what's the difference between a legionary and auxiliary, once the film is made, it goes off to the publicity people. So you get a whole load of emails coming from a whole load of new people, and you have to start telling them what the difference is between an auxiliary and a legionary, and you're really starting from scratch. And in fact, they prepared a leaflet, and I found my leaflet the other day, which gives a lot of information, and they sent it to me for checking. And at one point, they actually say that a Roman soldier carried, and they said, a gladiolus.
Oh, dear.
And I was so tempted to leave that in. It's a gladius. The sword is a gladius. The gladioli is a plant.
I enjoy the image of Roman soldiers going to war, though, carrying a bunch of flowers. That's quite nice.
Edna Everage and her gladioli were in my mind at that point. But, I mean, the actual leaflet is really good and gives you a lot of information. And it was very interesting. But I did sort of sigh the first email I got, thinking, oh, here we go again. The difference between auxiliary and legionary is,
Oh, man, I didn't see the leaflet. I now I'm sad. I want a leaflet.
I've only got the one.
eBay.
It's quite substantial. It gives a lot of information about the story, the filmmakers, Rosemary Sutcliffe, where to go and see other things in the Roman period in Britain, how a Roman soldier lived, all about Esca and how he would have lived. It's all in this very large leaflet, which folds out into a big A3 sheet. It's a good one.
Wow. Okay.
That sounds impressive.
So cool. Did they hand these out at theaters? Did they send them to schools?
Yeah,
I'm just like,
you
why?
could pick them up in some of the cinemas, and I think they did send them out to some schools. But as I said, once teachers knew about the beheading scene, it killed it dead. So excuse the pun.
My final question, and again, I don't know how we stand as far as what information there is, was the relationship between the native British, using the term British very loosely, understanding that they're not actually British at this time, was the relationship between the different tribes and the invading, colonizing Romans, once the Romans had been there for a while, do you start to see people intermarrying? Is there more of a friendly relationship, or does it stay this acrimonious? Because when this film takes place, the Romans have been in Britain for a while.
Yeah, they've been around for a couple of generations.
Yeah, would there still have been this level of aggression?
It depends whereabouts in the country you were. When the Romans first invaded, their interaction with the local tribes varied depending on who was in charge of the tribes. There were some tribes, for example, the Iceni in the first instance before Boudica, they became client kingdoms of Rome. The Romans allowed whoever was their ruler to go on ruling. Cartamandia, who was the queen in charge of the Brigantes, also was allowed to go on ruling. They came to some amicable agreement. Others just fought tooth and claw all the way through. I mean, the Navanti in Dumfriesshire, for example, I don't think they ever accepted the Romans were around. There was always trouble. So it would depend. And the whole thing about the Boudican revolt is that when her husband died and she wanted her two daughters to become the rulers of that tribe, the Romans were not happy about that, largely because you had two young women. They were both teenagers at the time, young teenagers. You would have had two women who were likely to marry two men. There would have been a fight between those two men. They were very young, and therefore there would have been advisors from the rest of the tribe getting weighed in, and to the Romans that just implied instability. And so they said no, the girls could not take on their father's role. And Boudica took umbrage at this. I mean, she had other things to take umbrage with as well, but I mean, that was the main bulk of the situation. But the Romans were trying to do what was going to mean that things would be as stable as possible. But some tribes just weren't having any of it.
Mm-hmm. They just never kind of accepted and kept fighting. I see. Thank you.
So, okay, this is a very, I would say, popular film. I know plenty of friends who love it, who both are into history and who aren't into history. And the things that stick out to me for what is accurate are incredible. And then for the things that look accurate to someone who doesn't know, again, also incredible. So overall, did you really enjoy the experience? And like, would you do it again? Would you like to consult on more films?
I did enjoy it, yes. With all its faulty details, the Eagle's been seen by millions of people all over the world. I mean, I think it grossed over £8 million in its first week or something like that. I enjoyed it because I'd have to write an awful lot of books to get to that number of people. It was really interesting, and it was interesting to see how films are made from the inside and what happens both before and after and during. I think, yes, it was worthwhile. But I think one of the things that actually made it particularly touching for me was when the film came out, the students at Newcastle University, where I was teaching and running the museums, decided they were going to have an outing, that they were all going to go and see the film together, and they wanted me to go with them. So what we did was we all met up with a glass of wine and some pizza, and first I gave a short half-hour talk based similarly on what I'm talking to you now, about how it worked. And then we had the wine and pizza, and then we went off to see the film together. And at the end, and this must have puzzled the other people in the cinema, they all stayed sitting whilst the credits were running. And then when my name appeared, they all stood up and cheered hugely. And I was so touched, because very rarely, I think, does a professor or a lecturer in archaeology or any other subject get that sort of reaction from their students. And they said afterwards they really liked being involved and seeing what I'd been doing and why I was doing it. And I was really very sweet.
That's fantastic. Oh, that's really fantastic.
Oh, I love stories like that. Oh, yes.
As I
Oh,
say,
man.
it must have really puzzled the other people in the cinema. What the hell was going on? But
Oh, man. Well, I hope that maybe they just assumed, like, oh, well, she was part of making the film in some way. So maybe they're just applauding because you were attached to the project, which you were, which is awesome.
the other time we all went to the cinema was one of the Indiana Jones ones. The one where he rides a motorbike through the library.
The Crystal Skull.
Well, we had the departmental librarian with us, and we had to almost give a counselling afterwards. She was not happy. So,
yep, I can see that.
Oh, man. Well, one thing that I think I'm asked a lot as a scholar of reception is, how important really is being accurate in historical films? Is it more important to provide an entry point, sort of solid edutainment where you can have a bunch of things wrong because it will spur people to go find the real information, versus how accurate do we need to be in presenting things on screen? So I'm curious, as someone who worked on a film like this, how important is it to have real history translate through, or how much can we get away with, okay, just put something random in, and if they want to learn more, they can go find the info?
I think it probably depends on the period you're trying to portray, because there's some periods where people know nothing and therefore they won't be irked by seeing something which is completely anachronistic, and other parts where they're absolutely fine. But I think the situation here is that were we trying to be true to the book or true to the Roman period? And that didn't always sit well together. And things like the light summer cloaking, and the stirrups, things like that, there's practical reasons for it that until you've been historical advisor, you don't realise the constraints that you're under. I mean, I could have insisted on them wearing the proper Roman armour, and it would have cost a fortune. So they weren't going to let me do that. But yes, I think that is the problem when you're trying to make a film of a book. People who are really keen on the book are going to be jolly annoyed that you haven't got absolutely everything in as it was in the book. But there's often reasons, like we were discussing earlier, for example, the 13-year-old girl, which are not suitable for modern day audiences at all. They wouldn't feel happy about it. But I was rather alarmed when I went to a filming of the Eagle Tyneside Film Club. They asked me if I'd give a talk and then yet again watch the film. And it horrified me. There were two elderly people sitting at the front with their copy of the book. Oh, gosh. Not a script. And they were furious because there were phrases that they loved which weren't in the text. Oh, goodness. So, you're trying to balance out what the original author said. And if you don't stick to that, you're going to annoy somebody. And then you're trying to put across what it was really like at the time, which may not be what was in the book. And at the same time, you're trying to come through on a budget. It is quite tricky.
It sounds like a very delicate balancing act, especially if you're not doing something like The Lord of the Rings, which has a ridiculous budget and is multiple hours long.
But nobody's going to be pointing a finger saying that's the wrong date approach.
This is true.
Well, that's interesting because that brings up, a point that I never thought of, which is when thinking about, what historical films, books, whatever to include when teaching in a class. This is a film that if I did teach, I'd probably would be like, yeah, let me use it. Let me teach with it. But because it's based on a book, that does sort of constrain you in certain ways where you have to go, okay, well, remember it's based off of a book. So there's a bunch of stuff that may happen that isn't really good for the class I'm teaching. So does that impact the usability of this to use in a classroom? Like, would you use this in an undergrad level classroom?
And I do know colleagues of mine who have used scenes, not the whole films necessarily, but scenes. Yes, they have used that. I think what you need to do is go and read the book and then see the film again. Because sometimes, the Harry Potter films, I love the Harry Potter films, but I prefer the books. I saw the books first, and I was very annoyed when they kept missing out scenes that I particularly enjoyed, and I'm probably not alone in that. So I think if you read the book and then watch the film, you'll see that they are very, very different. But the essential plot is still there, if you see what I mean. The essential characterization is still there. So, but this is, luckily, as historical advisor, you don't have to make those decisions. Somebody else is making those decisions, because I would be deeply unqualified for doing that. I think people do need to, though, remember very much when Rosemary Sutcliffe was writing and the level of knowledge of Roman Britain at the time, and her own personal circumstances, which meant she couldn't nip off and check various things, needs to be borne in mind.
That's true. It's not like if you're writing an historical novel now and you're not sure about a specific point, you can do a very quick Google search.
You can Google it. Yeah, she couldn't do.
And that was not a thing in 1954. No. So, yeah, no, we'll definitely bear that one in mind.
Yeah.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been absolutely fascinating and very enjoyable.
I presume there's no fee.
No fee.
I presume there's no fee. No, never.
Unfortunately. Oh, well, thank you everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.
Hey, thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave us a review, and you can also follow us on social media at The Reading Party Podcast. If you'd like to leave us a book or movie suggestion, then email us at thereadingpartypod@gmail.com. See you next week.